I'm proud to be the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is the first and only civil rights center at a U.S. law school, whose work focuses primarily on the civil and human rights of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. And that includes a very diverse set of communities of different faiths and different ethnic and racial backgrounds. And today it's truly my pleasure to be hosting a nationally known, actually internationally known scholar as part of our Desecuritizing Muslim Identities lecture series of 2021 to 2022. And before I formally introduce Professor Edward Curtis IV, I want to first put a plug in for the Center for Security, Race, and Rights in case those of you who are in attendance have not had a chance to check out our website to learn more about our work. Please do at the center at csrr.rutgers.edu. And you can also join our newsletter. I assume many of you are on social media, so get out your phones and follow us on Twitter at RUCSRR, on Instagram, Rutgers CSRR, and Facebook.com/RUCSRR. We're constantly putting out news articles and some of our work products to educate people about the issues that we address within our mission. And also, we record and put up all of the videos of our lecture series on our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube, subscribe to our channel, Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. We also have a little YouTube button on our website that you can press. It'll take you directly there. And we're proud to say that in our 5 years since our founding, we have more than 70 lectures by internationally and nationally known scholars and lawyers and advocates who work on these diverse issues that we cover. Okay, and so it is really my distinct honor, and one other issue that's important for the lawyers in the audience is there is CLE credit that is available, and if you look in the chat, you will find the information for the CLE, and I will also read out the special code. CLE code 1 there are 2 codes that will be typed in the chat. And the first code is immigration, which is not case sensitive. And you go to the CLE form, which is in the chat at https://go.rutgers.edu, CLE form 0308. The second code is Midwest, and again, not case sensitive. And I will raise that again. Okay, so it is truly, truly, truly my distinct honor to introduce Professor Edward Curtis IV. First and foremost, for selfish reasons, I'm a huge fan of his work. He is, mashallah, one of the most prolific professors. I'm trying to keep up with him. I don't know if I'll ever catch up, but he's my pace horse, as they say. His 13 books have been called essential, exemplary, approachable, groundbreaking, must read, wonderful, and a model of clarity. He is the William M. and Gail M. Platter Chair of the Liberal Arts at the Indianapolis campus of Indiana University, the author or editor of 13 books. Professor Curtis is also the recipient of grants and fellowships from Carnegie, Fulbright, Luce, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He grew up in Southern Illinois, where his Arab ancestors immigrated before World War I, which we're going to hear more about in his book, which is the subject, his new book, which is the subject of our talk, Muslims of the Heartland, How Syrian Immigrants Made a Home in the Midwest, in the American Midwest. But his other books, I just want to highlight right now, Muslims in America, A Short History, published in 2009, was named one of the best 100 books of 2009 by Publishers Weekly, and his 2-volume Encyclopedia of Muslim American History was deemed one of the best references of 2010 by Library Journal. Professor Curtis's most recent work, again, the one we just discussed, I just highlighted, Muslims of the Heartland, How Syrian Immigrants Made a Home in the American Midwest, and Arab Indianapolis are just out. In addition to works written for general readers, Professor Curtis has penned scholarly articles for the Journal of American History, American Quarterly, and the Journal of American Academy of Religion. He has both a national and in local audiences and international audiences for his work. He's contributed interviews and articles to the New York Post, to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, National Public Radio, and the Associated Press, among other media outlets. He has also taught community college instructors and K-12 teachers how to integrate information about religion and Muslim American history and life across the curriculum. Professor Curtis enjoys collaborating with multiple community partners, which include Nur Allah Islamic Center, Al Huda Foundation, and Masjid Al Mu'mineen. And he is currently directing the Arab Indianapolis Community History Project. So as you can see, we are so fortunate to have Professor Curtis with us today. And without further ado, because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for him to speak as well as Q&A, he will speak for approximately 30 to 35 minutes. And then after that, I will be moderating the Q&A, and therefore you should feel free to ask questions in the Q&A during his speech, and then I will ask some of them based on limited time, but I'll ask some of them during the Q&A session, and we will end at 1:15. Okay, and with that, welcome, marhaba, salamu alaikum, ahlan wa sahlan, Professor Curtis.
Thank you so much, Professor Aziz, for that wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. It's my honor to be with you. I think this is the first time you and I have appeared side by side on screen. So I'm especially pleased to get this work in front of the audience of people who follow your work and the work of your center, and who are part of the greater Rutgers family. So thanks again for the invitation. I'll jump right in. I have a number of slides I want to show you. Most of them are images, and I want you to be able to soak them in because they help to communicate the story. And let me start by saying I'm perfectly comfortable with you judging my book by its cover. I commissioned this beautiful illustrated map from a Midwest artist, and all of its features are somehow communicate an important theme, place, or person in the book. This is a book as much about the Midwest as it is about the Syrian Muslim immigrants who are part of it, because it really places them at home in the Midwest, as opposed to always seeing the immigrant as someone who is torn between one place and another, who is overwhelmed by nostalgia or homesickness. This book firmly plants the feet of the first and second generation of Syrian Lebanese Muslims in the Midwest, which is exactly what they were trying to do, as you will see. And now we should be able to advance this. There we go. So oftentimes authors academics will talk about who the main theorists is, what is, whether it's CRT or, whatever my main theory is. My main theorist for this book was my maternal grandmother, Cassie Hamaway Moses Safa Caffrey. It was her stories, and she was like my second mother. It was the upbringing that she shared with me, the stories, her experience, her material objects. I would never have been able to imagine this book or the idea that there was a regional identity and a region of exchange among Syrians in general, but including Syrian Muslims, Syrian Druze, Syrian Muslims, Syrian Christians in the Midwest. Her stories helped me to imagine that existed. So she is the main theorist. She gets the credit for helping me conceptualize this book. It also turns out that let me see here. Is that going to work? There we go. Okay. Let me show you very quickly where. By the way, this is a modern map of Lebanon and Syria. When the first generation of Arabic-speaking immigrants from the Eastern Mediterranean came, that line between Lebanon and Syria did not exist. It was all part of the Ottoman Empire and often referred to as Ottoman Syria. So it would include the countries that today are Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. But all the characters of my book just happen to come from the eastern side of what today is the Syrian-Lebanon border. There were many, many immigrants also from what today is Syria, especially around Damascus. But these are all the villages from which the characters in my book came. Why did they come to the Midwest? This 1901 map of the railroads helps us to imagine why it is that these, not just Syrian Muslims, but Syrian Christians as well, would come to the Midwest. The American people have many virtues, as Karl Ernst once say, but history is not among them. So it is perhaps, we have forgotten, but oftentimes in our historical consciousness, of just how much the Midwest was the economic powerhouse of this country in the Gilded Age before World War I. And that's why they came. There was a reason why Chicago hosted the Columbian Exposition in 1893, because it was America's premier progressive, forward-looking city. So look at how the terminus of so many of those railroads. So immigrant groups, including Syrians, went to use those rails around 1901 when this map, that is the way in which they would get from one place to another. And there were Syrian, Lebanese populations all along that rail network, including Muslims. So first takeaway from my talk, it wasn't just that my granny, as we used to call her, my grandmother, that she helped me imagine Syrians as part of the Midwest. It turns out that by researching their lives, I understood how the Midwest worked as an interconnected region. The Midwest is a human geography connected by river, rail, and then in the 1920s by road. But it is much more than just that, just those sort of that infrastructure. It's a human geography in which people were connected by great events, by relationships with one another, by business networks, and by legal networks as well. Let me give you an example. Let's start in Michigan City, which is one of the places Michigan City is actually in Indiana, and it's on Lake Michigan. At one time, it had a larger number of Arabs worked for Haskell Barker making rail cars in 1915, then worked for Henry Ford in Henry Ford's automobile. And one of the challenges of doing this research was that so many people either changed their names or they didn't, or they did their best to produce their names in English at this time. So you can see all of these Alis. These are mostly Syrian Lebanese Shia Muslims. Joe Ali, Joe Ali, Joe Ali, Joe Ali, Im Ali, Sam Ali, Sam Ali. This is one of the ways I recreated their lives and tried to trace them. Just because you find them in a court case, for example, you still have to figure out which Joe Ali is in court, for example, because it's not clear which Joe Ali it is. So again, why did they come to the Midwest? Well, one of the families that illustrates this, and one of the main characters in my book, a woman who would become one of the most important Arab American Muslim leaders of the 1900s, Aliyah, she went by Aliyah Ogdi Hassan, or Aliyah Hassan, the co-founder of Access, which is the largest single Arab American social and economic service provider in the country, gave birth to the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn. Well, she was born in South Dakota, not in Detroit. And following her story from South Dakota to Detroit is one of the ways in which we can understand the human geography of the Midwest, of the Syrian Muslim Midwest. So this is Ali, or Alec, or Ali, he sometimes went by, Ogdi, and his wife Fatima, and their two kids. I don't know which one is Aliyah here, but they're both very cute. How did I figure out what Ali's life was like when he first arrived? Well, he came at first without Fatima, And he came by himself. He was a peddler. And I looked for him or similar names. You can notice if you look at this census from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, we have here, he was living at a border house. His name here is Ogda Alec, or Ali Ogdi. And he was a boarder. And once I figured out that address, I could figure out a little bit more about what his life was like. He lived, if you look at the left-hand side of your screen, in one of these wood-framed, yellow-colored houses that abutted or backed up to the Big Sioux River in Sioux Falls. I wouldn't have wanted to have been there when the river flooded. It would have been the first to be, but these are Sanborn insurance maps. You can tell, roughly these would have been very low ceiling, very cheap kind of housing that he lived in. But right outside his door, he had mostly what he needed. He had his telegraph office, a tailor shop. He could a cigar factory, a grocery, and a billiards hall, which was very popular among the men and the boys, among the Syrian and Lebanese Muslims and Christians. One of the reasons why the Midwest became the economic powerhouse of the country was because in 1890, the US Congress canceled many of the treaties that it had signed with Native American indigenous population in both Western North Dakota and Western South Dakota. These treaties were with different peoples, but one of the greatest treaties were just signed at Fort Laramie. And we think, oh, surely, this was signed in the 1860s. Very late. Very late, after the U.S. Civil War is over, the federal government signs this treaty, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, with various indigenous peoples. By 1890, they've canceled that, and what they do is in the 1880s, the U.S. Congress also passes a law called the Dawes Severalty Act. It severs Native Americans from their indigenous lands, and it gives that land to the federal government to be used for homesteading. And these homesteads can be given to Native people, but generally they are given to all those who are willing to come out west and take 160 acres for a nominal fee so that they will engage in intensive agriculture, not grazing, but intensive cash crop agriculture. By the end of the 19th century, as a result, North Dakota became the largest single wheat producer in the United States, of all the states. And this is what gave birth to one of the first mosques in America. You'll see on the right of your screen, Roths, North Dakota. And but when they got there, they had to live in these 10 by 12 tar paper shacks, sometimes in minus 30-degree weather. These were very hardy folk. Now the Ogdis, they went to Western South Dakota, and Aliyah was born around 1910, 1911, outside of Kadoka, and right outside of Kadoka are the Badlands, in case any of you have ever been to the beautiful Badlands. Anyone who have been to the Badlands will tell you it would be very hard to imagine planting wheat there. And in the end, this land really could not be used for intensive agriculture. But Ali Ogdi, Aliyah's father, proved up. He got his land patent here. This is, you can see, this is how we can trace, right? He got his land put right by the Black Hills, okay? And there was only one problem. Let me see here. The Fatima, his wife, hated it. And one day, and this is the chapter 1 of my books, starts with the line, "The rattlesnake was the final straw." When the rattlesnake came to almost bite the two kids and killed the dog, Fatima said, "I've had enough. I'm either going back to Syria or we're moving to the city, Sioux Falls." So Ali said, "All right, fine." They went back to, and really Aliyah Ogdi Hassan grew up in the city, the small city of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Now, let me just mention, especially since this is a legally focused, notice then that for the purposes of land settlement, that Syrian people are not discriminated against. This is very important. Some scholars have given the impression that Muslims are only the objects of discrimination. But from the post-Civil War period on, some Muslims, if they are Syrian, for example, they do have the privileges of whiteness, and they do participate in the dispossession of Native American lands, even if they don't know it. Ali Ogdi may not have known that this was Native American land. He may not. Remember, his English would have been very bad, and he was illiterate, for decades in English. He was just signing his X, right? But so he may not have known it, but whether intentionally or unintentionally, he's taking these Native American lands. Who gets these lands? Well, for a long time, it was only those who were white, because according to the Homestead Act, you had to either be a citizen of the United States or you had to be eligible for citizenship. By 1890, Chinese people were not eligible for US citizenship because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But Ali Ogdi, the Syrian Muslim, is. So for legally speaking, Ali Ogdi is white. And now African Americans also qualify, but there's so much social discrimination against them that they don't come out to the Dakotas. However, they do homestead quite a lot in the American South, where they do have lands from this time. So, but Asians basically are excluded, but in this sense, at least in the Western North Dakotas, we have Syrian Muslims being white for this purpose. Okay. Let me advance. There we go. Okay, so this brings up, do Syrian Muslims face discrimination? Social, yes, no doubt, all the time. There are fights. There are teenagers who are beating them up. They get, there's police violence. I mean, there's social and some state violence, yes. But do they always face legal discrimination? Again, I think this has not been nuanced in the academic literature enough. The answer is it completely depends on locality and era. For example, in 1908, the US federal government declares through the Department of Commerce and Labor, at that time it was the Department of Commerce and Labor, it was the same ministry or cabinet position, that Syrians weren't in fact white, and thus they weren't eligible for citizenship, and thus they're not eligible to homestead because they can't become citizens. Okay. It is fascinating how already after 20 years of being in places like Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the Syrian Muslim and Christians have become enough of a part of their communities that local judges refused to cooperate with the federal marshals who are trying to come into the courts at that time. In order to become a citizen, your local court would be the place where you would take your citizenship, and they would be in charge of. Remember, the federal government was much smaller at this time, and so the federal marshals come in, they try to get, and the local judges are saying, this is ridiculous. How can you change the terms of citizenship you already had? So even in a Cedar Rapids Evening Gazette, we say, we have local leaders standing up for these Syrians and saying, no, you can't do this. This lacks due process. And they say this in other places in the Midwest. This lacks due process. They go on and on. Okay, so 1908, 1909, we already have, a very nuanced picture. There we go. So in Cedar Rapids, where I just showed you that newspaper article, before World War I, Syrians are often seen as another white ethnic immigrant group. Yes, they're not. These are not Mayflower people. These are not WASPs, but they're white ethnics, like Greeks, like Jews, like other immigrants. So many of the immigrants around this time in the Midwest were coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe rather than Central Europe. Okay, this is and the Midwest, remember, is in desperate need of their labor, because all of that land taken from Native Americans is pushing up yields. The railroads are making it possible to ship because of the railroads, and also the refrigerated railroad car allows meat to stay good for much longer. So we're talking about an incredible agricultural revolution going on, an economic revolution. That surplus, that economic surplus, is providing additional capital, which is helping to fuel the industrialization of all those factories along the Great Lakes, what will become known affectionately as the Rust Belt. Well, they need labor for all of this, right? They need labor. And so this is why millions of people come, many from Southern and Eastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. We have, in this case, they become very important to the city. So city officials defend whiteness and citizenship eligibility against federal prosecution, like I just showed in the 1909 Gazette. Now, why is Cedar Rapids so friendly? Well, this is why locality matters so much to the law and to the society, because Bohemians, or that is Czech and Slovak people, but they called themselves and they were known as Bohemians. And to this day, if you go to Iowa, they often refer to themselves as Bohemian. So the Czech and Slovak people had gained so much power that they had introduced the idea that you could be a good American and value the language of your ancestors. They had language academies. They had all kinds of clubs and lodges and performances and Sokolovna gymnasiums and all kinds of things in Cedar Rapids. And so this Bohemian minority, but it was a powerful Bohemian minority, really paved the way for the idea that ethnic difference could exist. Did this extend to Native Americans and Black people? It did not. It did not. It was just that at this time, in this place, Syrians could act as another, including Muslims, as another white ethnic immigrant group. Do they still face social discrimination? Yes. But are they defended by powerful interests? Yes. It's both and, not either or. All right. Now, this is extremely different than Michigan City, Indiana, which I already introduced you. By the way, when I met Yusuf Hussein, I thought I was seeing my grandfather. My grandfather was recruited out of Broken Arrow, or Drumright, Oklahoma, rather, by Newt Rockne to play football at Notre Dame, which is where he met my grandmother from Cairo, Illinois, and they were Arabic-speaking Syrian people, and they married, or kind of set up married, both getting good educations, and which was very much valued at the time. One of the things my book shows is just how much the fathers of daughters valued the education of their daughters in the 1920s. It was, some of the stories are just remarkable. So this is, when I saw this man, feats of physical feats and such were so valued by this population. And this is Yusuf Hussein, this beautiful man. He was called, a lot of wrestlers would use an ethnic moniker at the time, and he called himself the Terrible Turk. Now, for wrestling fans, there are many Terrible Turks in the history of wrestling. This is one of them. He had his own fan club. Why was wrestling popular? Well, among boys and men in Michigan City, it was one of the few places where they could earn some money and command public space, because much of the public space of Michigan City was closed to them. So it's very reminiscent of, the racial politics of athletics in the United States. Before World War I, Syrians were regarded as people of color subject to police violence, as well as social and legal discrimination. Syrians were not allowed to swim on the beach in many instances, or if they attempted to go through the lovely white park, they would oftentimes be harassed or kicked out. So this is around the turn of the century. I already mentioned how important they were In this case, industrial interests really attempted to try to repress Syrian self-determination or Arab self-determination. John Barker thought one of the reasons he hired so many Arabs was that their English wasn't good, and he thought that he could prevent unionization by keeping a really ethnically diverse population, so that the ethnic groups would fight with each other rather than unite. Takeaway, now another takeaway, but here's the changing point, is that World War I is a turning point in the political lives of Syrian Muslims throughout the Midwest, not just in Cedar Rapids, but also in Michigan City, in Dearborn, in Detroit, really not in Dearborn's, new at that point. So Detroit, Highland Park, all throughout the Midwest. Why and how? Well, in Michigan City, the very first person conscripted. Okay, remember that in World War I, that most Americans were dead set against the United States going to war, right? Completely against the war, all right? And so the federal government had to go to extraordinary measures. A Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, went to extraordinary measures to get Americans involved in World War I. The US Congress passed two acts, the latter of which was the Sedition Act, which essentially banned free speech and which was upheld by the Supreme Court. And because if you basically spoke out against the war or impeded in any way the recruitment of soldiers for the American Expeditionary Force, you were guilty of sedition. Across the Midwest, the German populations were severely repressed, oftentimes put in concentration camps, like in Fort Leavenworth, and also pacifists were put in these camps and sometimes died within them because they were not taken care of in these camps. So we're talking about the federal government is growing by leaps and bounds in World War I. Their ability to influence Americans' daily lives is increasing, in part through this kind of intense nationalism that's going on. The other side of that intense nationalism is, if a foreign national volunteers to fight for the United States in the American Expeditionary Force and their service is approved, by law, the law changes, they can become citizens of the United States. And this is a tradition until very recently has been a long tradition. If you serve the United States in the US military, you have a pathway to citizenship in the United States. And the very first person who was conscripted in Michigan City was a Syrian Muslim, referred to as a Turk. At this time, until after World War I, in Michigan City, as opposed to Cedar Rapids, in Cedar Rapids and in Sioux Falls, they were called Syrian Mohammedans or Muslims. In Michigan City, they were called Turks, but they're not ethnically Turk. These are Arabic-speaking Syrians from the Levant or from the Eastern Mediterranean. And the first one was Muhammad Dabaja or Daboja. He was one of many Syrian Muslims who served for Michigan City. And this had a great impact. One of the Michigan City's evening news's favorite reporters to get the sense of the troops, the morale of the troop, was Joe Alley or Joseph Alley. But Joe Alley, when he tried to go get a bathing suit, and back then, by the way, bathing suits, they were a lot more involved. He was going to rent one. You got to think more about like Spanx or something. We're talking, they're really, they're get-ups. These are not just like one pieces you throw on. So he goes to tries to get a bathing suit, and somebody says something like, "We don't want that Turk around here." So he sues, and a jury of his white peers sides with him in the case. And this case desegregates the beach for Syrians in Michigan City, not for Black people who continued to not be allowed to go to the beach, but for Syrians. So this is a big turning point for the Syrian Muslim population. Now we're beginning to run out of time. So I'll try to go as quickly as I can through the period between World War I and World War II. During this time, Muslim religious congregations, like other Midwest congregations, whether Christian or Jewish, built cultural and social and political power. They were pathways, not impediments to assimilation. Now, what do I mean by that? First, let's have a look at the mosques. The first purpose-built mosque was by the Carew brothers in Highland Park in Michigan City. In Highland Park, Michigan, in 1921. By the end of the decade, it had been taken down. This no longer exists, but this is the first purpose-built mosque. Then in 1929, we have the mosque in Roths, North Dakota. Yes, it does look more like a granary than a mosque, but that was their mosque. Only cost $600 to build. They didn't have much, they were very poor farmers. In 1931, this was not purpose-built. The Muslims in Michigan City, like Muhammad Dabaja and others, they bought this house 3 blocks away from Lake Michigan, beautiful lakeside setting for a mosque. Oh, and in the basement, they would sing Arabic songs, dance Arabic dances, eat kufta and kibbe and tabbouleh and hummus. And then on the second floor there, they would pray. And you can barely see the sign and the minaret. The minaret looks more like a chimney. And the name of the congregation was Asr al-Jadid, new generation or new era. Then in Cedar Rapids, what's affectionately called the Mother Mosque, the only one of its generation that still exists. They called it the Muslim Temple in order to explain to people what it was. In Arabic, Al-Nadi al-Islami, the Islamic club there. This was a time of growth. One of the reasons Cedar Rapids grew so much is that banks weren't much trusted in the Depression, and your local corner grocery, including Syrian groceries, became like financial institutions. And it was one of the few places you could actually get credit. So they would extend credit, and this is why the grocers did very well. Notice that too, one of the fun things about that is, notice how much time has changed. Remember that in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, everything became more socially conservative after the 60s and 70s. But back in the 30s, it was okay for Muslim grocers to sell Pabst Blue Ribbon and Armour hams and Old Milwaukee. No big deal. They went to the mosque, they prayed, and they sold hams and Pabst Blue Ribbon. It wasn't seen as any kind of problem back then. But times have changed, right? They loved to have fun together. They would come from miles around. They would mourn each other's dead. They would marry each other's kids. Look at this beautiful multi-generational crowd here. We have 1, 2, maybe 3 generations, but definitely 2 generations. We've got women in hijabs and also in flapper girl hats, 1920 style flapper girl hats. We've got men in fedoras, but also in newspaper boy, Great Gatsby hats. They're all on this beautiful, not too far from the lake in Lake Michigan. And people would have come from, miles around to go lodge, and maybe they'd have a maharajan, that is a festival, or a hefle. This is probably a maharajan. If you're going to come all this way, you might have had a 2 or 3 day event. And you see it says here, Ihtifal Jamiat al-Asr al-Jadid al-Islami, the gathering of the community, or of the new era or new generation Islamic community. And this is in Michigan City. That lodge was built by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, in the 1930s. The second generation was completely integrated into their local circumstances. Here's Abe Hamid. This is his award-winning 4-H award-winning Holstein in Fayette, Iowa. But Abe was also brought up with this 150-year-old handwritten Quran, which they brought to Iowa with them. So it was not, this is that bothness I was talking about. You could do both. It wasn't an either or. In Cedar Rapids, things had progressed so much that by the anniversary of that mosque I showed you, the Iowa Secretary of State headlined the local Muslim temple anniversary. This is big. I mean, we couldn't get Barack Obama to go to a mosque when he was president because of the worries of Islamophobia. But the Iowa Secretary of State in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, went to, and it's prominently featured in the, it's not a secret visit, it's in the newspaper. So this indicates a kind of public acceptance of Islam and Muslims and these Syrians, at least these type of Muslims, let's say. Takeaway. So you can tell from the picture I've given you, these were very vibrant communities. The fate of these communities largely depended on historical forces like agriculture, economics, and industrial growth, not any lack of individual effort or desire of the community to sustain their religious congregations. There was an old stereotype in Arab American and Muslim American studies that these people weren't religious. I just think that's flat out wrong. I think they were religious, and some of their mosques declined just because of forces that were very much beyond their control. Like really, the Muslim farmers out in Western North Dakota, they couldn't help it that this land was basically, you couldn't farm it. I mean, it was not, ultimately, it was not arable in the end. And these, by the way, these are the farmers there on your left. Mary Juma on the right, and her grandkids. She was one of the first women homesteaders and peddlers out there in Western North Dakota. And so one of the reasons why Detroit became what it was because people from Michigan City and Sioux Falls, people like Sergeant Ali Joseph Said and Aliyah Ogdi Hassan, because they eventually went to Detroit. And they took everything that they had experienced in those other places with them, making it the capital of the Arab Muslim Midwest. But it wasn't a foregone conclusion in 1900. It became that over time, in part because of forces like the building of the Rouge factory, which you see here in the illustration, but also other things. So I'm going to conclude before our discussion by saying this. I began the book with my own story because writing this book was a deeply emotional experience. And one of the, by the way, I just got back from Iowa, where last week the children, and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the characters in my book came to see this talk in Cedar Rapids. And then for those of you who are familiar with Arab and Arab American culture, you won't be surprised by this. Then basically adopted me, and I spent the whole next day with them, going from house to house, drinking coffee, meeting for breakfast, going out to see the farm. And I also got to visit with the widow of Abdullah Igram, the founder of the Federation of Islamic Associations, the largest single Sunni Muslim group before the Islamic Society of North America. And she still speaks Lebanese colloquial Arabic. And it made me even more connected to this story. But one of the things that this story did for me was, as I researched and discovered their stories, I came to think of my own childhood differently. I grew up in rural Southern Illinois. All of my people are from Southern Illinois. But as long as we've been there, everyone still asked me when I was a kid, what are you? And they meant, what race are you? Because you can hear my accent. I don't sound like I'm from anywhere but the Midwest. And so what are you? And that was a painful experience because I didn't quite fit in. Well, it turns out the writing of this book helped me realize that my story, the story of my family and those other Arab Muslims, Arab Christians, Arab Druze, and all other Arabs, our story is not my own place in the Midwest, was not so strange. I wasn't just some sort of brown intervention in a white bread land. It turns out, of course, that the Midwest has always been diverse. And when we write brown and Native and Black people out of the story of the Midwest and we call it flyover country and we assume that it's all deeply, white nationalists, we give the KKK the victory it desired, which was to wipe away the diversity of our region, of this place where I was raised and where I now work. And so I came to value so much the idea, as I conclude in the introduction, that those of us who care about this place will keep working for a place that loves its people, loves all its people, and loves us abundantly. Thank you so much, Zaha, for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor Curtis. Oh, that was so informative on multiple levels. And I think the most important aspect of just me listening to you and reading your work is how you're contributing to the production of knowledge, and how that is one of the many ways in which we can, I think, have a more accurate understanding of the rich history of this country. And so, and I know that it is a labor of love to write a book, much less, the 13 books you've written. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm going to ask you a question, and then we'll turn it to the audience. So,
and I'll just mention one thing. The one thing that's kind of, and this doesn't characterize all relationships, but I do want to know that you think that people don't cross these lines in love. For example, in Cedar Rapids and in Michigan City, there are a number of Jewish Arab marriages, and I'm talking about more that happened more than 50 years ago. So, we have to, it's just a reminder, even if that's a small number, that, that there are always exceptions, and that one has to be careful not to think of the Midwest as some sort of backwater where everybody is in their own little corner and never actually, gets to know one another.
Right. Well, if there's one thing that I would love to, one stereotype we have about the Midwesterners, which I think is a good one, is that they're friendly. And I don't think I've ever met someone who's from the Midwest that is not friendly and hospitable and kind. I'd like to, my nationalist sense makes me wonder if that has to do with the influence of the Syrians and the Arabs in the culture, as well as other cultures. But with that, we're really, really grateful for you taking the time out of your busy schedule to enlighten us with your expertise. Professor Curtis, you are, this is the first time that you and I have had a chance to interact professionally, and I am more impressed than I even expected, because your brilliance shines through the screen.
Well, thank
and
you.
I know
That's
that you
very
have
kind.
many fans, including me and those who are of the younger generation. So I can't thank you enough. Do you have any?
It's my pleasure to be, and thanks for the great questions. The audience had wonderful questions.
Thank you so much. And so I'll before everyone leaves, I'll just put a pitch for the next and final lecture for the Desecuritizing Muslim Identities, which is by Dalia Mogahed, who is the Director of Research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which is the only, I think tank that focuses on the socioeconomic and political research of American Muslims. So ispu.org, I recommend you check them out. But most importantly, I recommend that you attend our lecture on March 30th at 12 noon with Dalia Mogahed. And again, thank you so much, Professor Curtis. Everybody should go buy his book if you haven't already, Muslims of the Heartland, How Syrian Immigrants Made a Home in the Midwest. And with that, ma'as salama, assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum. Bye.